groovy. Okay, so we think about not, well, again, here's my argument. You have to arrive at your own values and stance, and you'll talk this through with your supervisors. But if I assume that the idea is not do we incorporate parents, but how do we, then we go through kind of an assessment, a little mental checklist and a review of what's no. Okay. So the following examples are not the best examples or the worst examples. They're just examples, and they have context-specific relevance as well as nuance. So a soundbite on each of those, and then I think I have a little bit Q&A, a break, and then some activities prepared for the group. Okay, so I'd be happy. I just saw in the chat. I'd be happy to talk about working with divorce parents, for example. That's a usual and dynamic and complex challenge. Dr. Alicia Lieberman is at UCSF, so that was another question that was asked and answered. And to the extent that you're past the adventures of coursework and now just in the adventures of clinical work, it might be nice to do a little bit of elective reading. And if you're going to be in child therapy for a career versus a moment in time, you might even lean into this with enthusiasm, because all of our heroes and major thinkers have some good user-friendly stuff. So the parent management training model is a model designed to impart, what is known about the science of learning. So here's how I kind of reduce it into a soundbite for parents. And here's when I roll it out as kind of at least an outline. I don't say, allow me to show you the parent management training protocol. I say, oh, so we're wondering quite a lot about, this challenging behavior. Would it be okay if I assert some ideas about how we, kind of get some good momentum going in maybe a different or new direction? So that's my little, kind of lead in. So this is not a punishment model, and kiddos who are kind of classified or characterized as bad actors in their schools and or who are engaging in the usual behaviors that frustrate or concern parents are frequently punished. You're busted. And if you're busted, you might stop what you're getting busted for indefinitely, but I mean, if you get barked at once and you course correct, you probably don't need therapy, right? But if you're getting busted for the same thing over and over again, then logic would dictate that the punishment made you stop for a second. It didn't make you stop the problematic thing in any lasting way, nor did it teach you what to do instead, right? And so the idea here in rolling out some behavioral coaching is really about talking to parents along the lines of learning. Let's treat it as a skill. You taught your kiddos etiquette, how to say thank you and kiss your auntie, and you taught them hygiene and how to use the restroom. Well, at time point 3rd grade or time point 7th grade or time point 11th grade, there are still behaviors that, if not yet happening enough, we can practice. We can put some structure around getting these things to happen more frequently. And so the model of behavior change in consultation with parents is not to coach them on what is a reasonable consequence for an infraction, as much as it is to impart some curiosity about how do we get the expected behaviors happening. Okay, so it's about up-training the better stuff, not squashing the stuff of concern. Dr. Alan Kasdan suggests this concept of the positive opposite. And so, the opposite of getting thrown out of school is, well, don't do that. The opposite of hitting your sibling is quit that, and et cetera, et cetera. So, but what is the positive opposite? It's this idea of a replacement behavior. The opposite of interrupting isn't don't do that, because that's not a behavior at all. You can't teach or practice or reinforce the absence of behavior, but you can, get a program going around, use an inside voice, tap my shoulder, ask me politely, look at me and see if I'm available or not, go away and come back in 5 minutes. But this idea of coming up with some anchors. One of the things that we'll see in strained family systems is that communication is less than abundant or precise. And so one really nice thing about this model is that it invites parents to be very specific. And here's where a behavioral coaching model is cohesive with even, strength-based and solution-focused ideas in counseling. The whole idea of what is our preferred reality, or, the miracle idea, if we woke up tomorrow, what all would be happening then that's better than what's happening today. Even that is behavioral insofar as we're trying to operationalize what is it that we're working towards, or what would represent, or, kind of count as a measure in better. So reinforced practice and prompting are, the ideas of working with kiddos on doing the important things when they're not required to do it. And then, encouraging them to do it right before it's go time, and then giving all sorts of some feedback. So when might this be appropriate? So parents will, or the schools will ask you, hey, school-based therapists, help us help this family because homework is always World War III, or getting out of the house on time and there's an attendance issue. Or, man, not only is this kiddo rude and defiant at school, this seems to be, the scenario at home. So when there are discrete behaviors of concern and a desire for the better behaviors to kind of get up and running, one starting place is to talk with parents around a framework for thinking about this as not as good boy, bad boy, or moral or mental health, but just like, let's treat it as any other educational objective. We have to have a goal and a system of working after it. Now, if for those of you who will be working in high school or even in middle school context, the symbolic reinforcers of every time you do the job on your job description, you get a little credit that's redeemable for a privilege or a special event. I don't say that that's irrelevant, but it might not just feel, kind of gritty enough for the realities and urgencies of the problems that manifest a little bit later on. And, for the little itty bitties to, have a little reinforcement program for staying in your seat, for writing your name on your worksheet, for giving, saying kind things to friends, that it might be a little bit easier. But the aspects of behavioral reinforcement are, verbal feedback, some punctuating affection, and then, kind of the access to the goods, i.e. it works in your favor to do, said behavior. When I talk to parents about this, I wonder with them about where there is urgency. It's like, are you kidding me? This is what a tornado of stress. There are 17 things. Let's pick one. Let's pick one. Let's pick a juncture in the routine, or let's pick the easiest one or the hardest one. But the idea of like, let's narrow the field, hone in on one particular thing. That's good from a psychotherapy research perspective. We talk about hope and optimism being a common factor variable associated with wellness promotion and effectiveness of therapy, trans-theoretically. One of the things I like about very specific behavior change consultation with parents is that it can impart the idea or even exude the support of, we don't have to tackle all of this. We're just making a little project around this. And the cool part, excuse me, about this, if it is attention grabbing at all, is that it's very easily, kind of shifted to other goals, other times of the day, other behaviors, etc. So, I give a whole semester on this and a whole 3 hours on this with my graduate students. Here's what I want to more orient this group to, if this isn't a model that you're already familiar with. The big picture when we're working with parents, and especially parents who come from multi-stress or are doing their parenting in a multi-stress context, advice giving tends not to be the jam, especially when it's unsolicited, or especially when it's like, yeah, that all sounds well and good, but how am I going to get that off the floor with all of the 1,000 things that I'm, kind of having to face or address? The spirit of behavioral consultation, as espoused in a model like this one, includes things like getting specific, having an approach, being systematic, and kind of measuring change. And this is actually a really great thing to do with our teacher colleagues who might confide in you, the campus counselor in front of the coffee machine, of like, yeah, I'm really concerned about juniors' behavior in such and such. What would you have them do more often that would represent a little bit more harmonious participation in your classroom? That ask is, again, in line with, okay, so this is what we're wanting. How do we say that that's their job? How do we prompt for them to do that? How do we reinforce even when they're doing a lousy version of it? And how can we make that motivating for them? Um, you'll meet some very skillful teachers who are ninjas at reinforcing compliance even when the attitude is very lousy. The very thing that everybody else would kind of give a kid the "don't talk to me in that tone" kind of way, they forego working on the attitude part and reinforce "thanks for showing up on time." So it's amazing that these kind of reinforcement principles I don't have to be as clinical or as Skinnerian as people are afraid that they might come across as. If we kind of deliver them in a big picture kind of way. So we can get on the horn with parents and say, hey, I'm a colleague to your kiddo's teacher or to the counselor or vice principal at the school. Part of my role is to think together with parents about laying down some tracks for getting X or Y or Z going better. Would you be interested in some ideas along those lines? I will say this, that frequently when we kind of roll out the outline that we have student loans and understanding, then a parent would say, boom, life curveball, such as divorce, or my other kid is in the hospital, or my husband just got deported, or we're losing access to this subsidized housing and now we're starting from scratch looking all over again. So guess what we do when we start with a parent consultation and we become aware of a life curveball or kind of a stress variable? We stop, quit consulting, and use that as an opportunity to show attunement, care, and a family-centric stance. Wow, whoa, okay, let me understand that. How can I be helpful? Right. So a consultative strategy, which kind of has a beginning, middle, and an end, and a protocol, if you will, is still very, very useful when there are multiple stressors, because even if you don't follow it as they do in the Yale clinic that's researched or something like that, we can be talking up ideas about what are the changes that we want, how do we work on them, and given the limited bandwidth, what are the ways to incorporate some of these ideas. But even if we just kind of have to can it all together or table it for another moment in time, if we're patient and focused enough to upload and attend to the story, oh, okay, great, but let me get you back on this sticker program. It's like, come on, fry the biggest fish. That's a principle in family therapy. If we start consulting with parents in the way of advising or recommending, and they let us into their life and their story, guess what? We're well positioned to be a great participant in the family therapy. And maybe we'll do a shiftaroo. Maybe it would be child visits, or maybe it would be advocacy, or maybe it would be social work, right? If any of us ever are there any LCSWs on the call? If you are, you're amazing. I love MFTs and psychologists and school counselors. But if anybody ever confuses you to be a social worker because you found some food or some rent or some free after school athletics, man, that's like the best compliment. If somebody thinks that, wow, this person represents looking for stuff, that's the best. So if we start with consulting and we realize that that's not going to be germane until some kind of bottom of the Maslow's pyramid issues are addressed, that's good too. That's a good outcome. Okay. So that's the that's the Yale. So if you read the Kasdan method or the Everyday Parenting Toolkit, or you can look at the research literature on parent management training. It's robust and not without its limitations. Less effective with multi-stressed families, and most effective in that kind of 3 years old to 11 to 12 years old range. Our teens are tending to need a more integrative or comprehensive kind of approach. Are you familiar with the work of Ross Greene? Okay. Hey, he's on my top 5 book recs for all mental health professionals. So his first work was called Treating the Explosive Child. And then he has other books called Raising Human Beings, and Lost at School is another good one if you're going to be doing school-based family counseling. So he is a clinician researcher, and those are better than researchers because they have lots of adventures in working with kids and families. And he articulated an approach that's often referred to as collaborative problem solving. There are whole school districts and juvenile halls and residential treatment facilities and teams that are trained in collaborative problem solving. His beginning research is suggesting things like suspensions and expulsions and detention referrals are going down, and use of isolation in juvenile halls going down, and use of hands-on restraint and milieu therapy program for teens going down when staffers are trained in this collaborative approach. So I think that this is a real natural framework for family therapy, and yet another way in which we might have a collaboration with parents. So in this Kasdan model or consultative model, the kids are not a part of it. It's more of like a parent coaching and think tank approach. In this model, I would say it's family therapy because all members are present. So wow, yeah, this is also something that I present on extensively, and it informs a lot of the family therapy efforts that I engage in. I'll try to give the cliff notes as quick as I can. So in behavior, kind of oriented models, the idea is that we can motivate kids to behave in ways that are more adaptive. Ross Green's position is that kids do well when they can. And so we do well as mental health professionals to entertain the distinct possibility that if a kid is behaving badly, it's because they're outstripped or something is hard for them or they're frustrated, not necessarily because they're attention seeking or amotivated or manipulative or working it, or they'd rather have fun than finish their homework or what have you. So all of those usual kind of classic interpretations of, yeah, you're just not towing the line, Junior. This approach disagrees with that vehemently and starts with the idea that we can understand almost every challenging behavioral presentation vis-a-vis this really groovy assessment mnemonic, which is to think about child development and ecological context. So here's my second little line I light on them here. Here it goes. A kiddo's skill and the demands placed on them to use that skill. If you are athletic and the cultural norm in your fourth grade is to play war ball at recess, you're probably doing okay. And if you're a klutz and the cultural norm is to play war ball, recess might be an arduous, stressful, lousy time where you get into a fight or get picked on or fold into yourself and isolate or something like that. So, before we, wonder about the more obscure possibilities for a curious behavior, this protocol would suggest that we develop this lens. If you had a human development course in your training or a child development course in your training, bear in mind that, we don't develop in all ways according to a, kind of cogent timeline. There's academic development, there's cultural development, there's identity development, and then there's like language development of your executive functioning skills, development of your social cognition abilities, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So to the extent that kids who behave badly don't behave badly all the time, but are more likely to, at certain junctures, reliably and predictably engage in, some sort of problematic behavior, it's very useful to wonder about where are they in the arc of their development relative to the request or the demand placed upon them. Because I work in a pediatrics program and I do assessments as a part of my job as a mental health professional, I'm pretty hip to how dyslexia goes and what is an expressive language problem, and these quirky kiddos who are probably on the higher end of the autism spectrum, and everybody thinks they're a jerk, but really they just have idiosyncratic thought processes, these kind of things. If you're required to speak up in class and you put your head down, or you don't participate, or you cry, or you run out of the room, or you, I don't know what, make a joke every time, it's very interesting that, because if being well spoken is hard and you're put on the spot, there you go, there's our prediction formula. We can expect that your behavior would be lackluster. And so this model is not a treatment of dyslexia or low language or hyperactivity. It's a problem solving model. So geez, I hope I'm making some sense here. If we think about that last example that I just came up with, if the unsolved problem is getting a kiddo to participate in a way that the teacher can assess and give them credit, we don't need them to be robust in their language. We do need to understand the teacher's needs and concerns, the kids' needs and concerns, and a mutually agreeable, workable, realistic solution to get on. And teachers are terrific, and kids have a lot to say if we ask them the right question. You know, so it could be that the kiddo is, oh, I'm so nervous, you know, and there are great assessment questions. Ross Green in this protocol has developed like this whole pocket of training called drilling for information. What words are in your brain when it's time to participate in class? How come it's easy to participate and speak up at this time, but this time feels so different? What are the exceptions to the difficulties in participating? There's lots of parts to participating. What part is the hardest? Coming up with your idea, saying it fully, thinking on your toes, using a loud voice, managing your nervousness. It's so interesting because if we become even incrementally clearer on a kiddo's concern, and then we understand kind of the bottom line from the teacher, we'll see all sorts of groovy things where a kiddo who might be sent to us for therapy, like that kid's all shy and anxious, what's going on here? Or is, you know, bucking the classroom, you know, routine or something like that. Teachers are terrific. You know, I've had teachers give kids the participation topic the night before, or agree to never put them on the spot, or say, I'm going to call on junior and junior and junior, and then I'll call on you. And it's like, give them lead time, or accept a thumbs up or a thumbs down, or etc. So if the bottom line is, if we solve the problem of participating, then here's what we do. We position teachers to champion kids, or parents to do the same. And we head off a certain frustration that loads on to bad behavior, getting worse, right? When it's an adult imposed solution. So in a family therapy context, in a parent engagement context, you know, this is a 3-part meeting, and you don't have to do this every week for weeks and weeks on end. It's a template or a conversation structure that we can recommend to parents. Okay, instead of talking to them about the behavior that is embarrassing, problematic, risky, talk to them about an unsolved problem. Try to get their concerns. Say what your concerns are, like how does that unsolved problem affect them or other people? And then, you know, get to the brainstorm aspect of how are we going to get on here? Everybody against the unsolved problem, not adults against kids, or, you know, we're not going to go down this punitive pathway, right? Let's go down we're going to work it out pathway. Why is this valuable or why am I talking about this as you guys have invited me to talk about incorporation of parents? I like this quite a lot because it's user-friendly in the context of being a public health therapist or a school community therapist versus a caseload therapist. Now, if you're doing private office, sorry, I'm full. I can't see anymore at this time. If you're working in a school, for the duration of time you're committed to that school, kind of the call is to be a player when there's a need, right? And so this approach to, you know, touching in with parents is not a commitment to, or maybe even a replacement for a weekly ongoing therapy, nor does it interfere with it. It's okay, there is an unsolved problem. Let me help you learn more from and with your kid about what their concerns are. Why is that a tricky situation for them? I've had teenagers tell me, Mr. So-and-so from 3rd period is an MFer, but Miss So-and-so from 4th period, she gets me. And if we're trying to, you know, kind of broach why a kid's cutting school, how about this? Instead of thinking the kid is self-sabotaging, let's understand their concerns, right? Because, you know, presumably even strict Mr. So-and-so from whatever period that the kid's not getting on with wants to see that kid graduate. And so maybe there's a way. Problem solving with parents, it's really, really groovy because it gives a way of thinking about the behaviors that the parent might have a misguided way of thinking about, but it also is just very practical, very practical. How do we, like, it's been tricky to get homework done, to come home on time, to stay out of hot water in science class. I'm always getting 10 emails a week from that teacher. Imparting to parents a structure for doing a working through with their kids, it's very good. It's parent deference, it's parent respect, and it's parent empowerment, i.e. you're more important than us. It's efficient because we can't, we can only do weekly therapy with 15 people, but we can do this. Let me show you this and get it off the floor with 100 people, right, in the same amount of time. So that's useful. And again, it cuts back to there being a focus. A lot of times you'll hear this, if you haven't, for my licensed colleagues on the call, I'll bet you a coffee, and sorry, you already lost the bet, you owe me the coffee. Like, how many times do we hear a kid will say, well, blah, 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 blah. Can you help me talk to my parent or teacher about that? Or the parent will say, blah, 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 blah. Can you have a talking to with my kid about that? And what do we always say? Let me help you talk to them about that. Or you talk to them, right. So this is exactly getting to that right away, right? Everybody is a stakeholder here. So what do we do? And here's a groovy outline. Now, Ross Green and colleagues have manualized this, so you can, when you get your license, you can get continuing education points on such a protocol, or even just do some independent reading. But it's really terrific. I think it's culturally sensitive, developmentally sensitive, family centric, and practical. The 3 steps are the empathy step, the define the problem step, and the what's the last step? I can't remember what it's called. But essentially, it's the kids' concerns, the parents' concerns, and solutions that, it's the invitation step is the last step. It's called, I wonder if there's a way that you could feel less nervous at participation time, but teacher could also assess that you're learning and participating. I wonder if there's a way that we could deal with the stressors of Mr. So-and-so, but also make sure that your buns is not in continuation school, but posting that high school diploma, right? So it's kind of that both and of, I hear your concerns, and then there's these other issues. So what realistically is, it's flexible than you just have to do, is more flexible than you have to do it this way. But it's not, we can do whatever. This is really beautiful. And in family therapy, I've had like kids say, well, just adopt my sibling out of the family. Darn it. It's like, okay, that would solve your concern, but it's not realistic. So there are rules and protocols. It has to be meeting everybody's concerns. It has to be mutually satisfying. It has to be viable. What a great thing to do with parents in a short-term potent intervention kind of way. And it's less intrusive than consultation, because we don't superimpose the outline, we evoke their values and preferences. So one of the tricky parts about consultation is when we're recommended to people who didn't initiate the collaboration. Now, I work sometimes in my hospital role where people are like, doctor, doctor, doctor. And it's like, my name is Joe. Thank you, doctor. It's like, if there's this idea of like, I'm ready for somebody who knows a lot about this to give me some ideas, that bespeaks an eagerness for the input. And so, okay, coach away, teach them the outline. But it's a lot more delicate when the vice principal or the dean recommended, or the parent, the kiddo got busted, and so we introduce ourselves versus like, hey, help us with it. So that's part of the calibration piece. But I like collaborative problem solving because it's not clinician led. It's friendly to the child's experience of their conceptualization, not of why they're behaving bad, but of why there is an unsolved problem. And it also, parents have ultimate veto power in this model too. So it's not whatever the kid proposes, or, and teachers and schools have ultimate veto power too, but it's just about flexibility. This is a big part of social emotional education and training kids how to use their people skills. So there's some other additional benefits to the possibility of a experience near problem being broached. I hope I'm saying that okay. I wish I could talk for 10 hours about this or a whole semester. It's a great model. I'd invite you take a look. Here's one more example model that I'll offer as in reference. We might be dealing with parents whose morale is shot because they're beat down by the stressors of marginalization or poverty or their kids' challenges. And so when we have the sense that we need to introduce some hope or instill some confidence, there is a tack that we can take that has practical, kind of child health promotion value, but it's also a great way in which we can interface with parents if we're operating from the position that A, they're more important than us, and B, that they can intervene in the most important real-time ways. Solution-focused interviewing, it's a postmodern psychotherapy. It's cousins with narrative therapy, I would say, in many ways. It kind of operates from this idea that where attention goes, energy flows. What we wonder about expands. And so it's kind of it's a counter to this idea that, you know, not that we have to do assessments, but that we have to have this diagnostic mentality. If the kid's behaving bad because they have this, or the family is struggling because of this hang up or dysfunction, is not a pathology driven, like, here's the symptom, here's the treatment model. But there is an assessment. I want to say that. So it's not like we don't care about what's going on. It's that we have a very particular interest in assessing for wherewithal. And the asking not only orients us to what the wherewithal might be. Reference my question, who's your favorite person on campus? The football coach, the cafeteria lady, well, nobody on campus, but my karate teacher and my youth pastor. It's good to know that, right? It's good to know what the resources are. And in a psychological, so there are practical resources like, you know, we have food stamps and scholarship assistance, but there are psychological resources too. And when we interview parents, we can learn about what those psychological resources are. So there is interviewing and assessment, but it's directional and it's biased. It's biased in the direction of wanting to know about a family's ability. Yeah. And all families have them. Most family therapies would agree with that assertion. Most family therapists would agree with that assertion, I think. Okay, so, you know, best hopes questions are very interesting. It's kind of an innocuous way to start any parent, you know, like, hey, I'm around at school this year and available to your kiddo. If I could be a useful character, well, you know, what all would we see happen? That's very nice, because it's parent centric. It invites their expertise and preferences, and it also gives us some insight into what is important to them. What is important to them, and we'll hear vastly different things and surprising things and assuring, reaffirming usual things. All sorts of things, but failing to ask it's problematic because it kind of bespeaks the I know better than you, which is a great way to be insensitive and culturally incompetent. That's a Captain Obvious statement. Best hopes questions are really, really useful because they position us to ask other empowerment and strength-based questions. When we hear about stories of life curveballs and the adventures of families hanging in there, we can ask questions like, how were you able to do that? Holy moly, you folks are tough as nails. Tell me that story a little bit more. Does that have any bearing on how we think about this current snag? In solution-focused interviewing with children, one invitation, there's a great literature on this, but one really cool question is to ask kids a past problems solved question. Tell me about a similar scenario that you moved through and what key ingredients and superpowers and good decisions made a difference then. Competency questions are really, really useful because the parent who is maybe even marginalized by the school community, as they're always grinding an axe but not following through, and they're always like, even parents who sadly might be cast in a bad light by an administrator or a teacher, when we get to appreciating their story or their trauma, invariably we're going to hear something in the neighborhood of what they've been doing to hang in there. And so asking parents, how were you able to do that? How had you navigated a similar situation when the relationship with the instructor or the school community wasn't easy, et cetera, et cetera. It's very, very, very useful because then what we're saying without saying is that we believe in parents, right? Which is a way to help them feel activated and engaged in psychotherapy. And not for nothing, but how do we know the therapy was pretty useful is when we arrive at, you know, the juncture where we don't have to keep doing it. And in a school context, instead of being the liaise between a parent and a school using therapy to do so, sometimes these parent interviews that, you know, help a parent flesh out what would they like to see happen in that school context and how have they been a playmaker for their child previously. It's very efficient, it's very respectful, it's very empowering, and it doesn't presume that we know. So good on many counts. Glimmer questions are pretty cool. when a parent wants to tell, and this is real, I tell my trainees this in the training program here at the hospital, is, hey, Dr. Joe, when an interview is kind of like sidelined by a parent who is not trying to complain, but just feels so nervous and they want you to appreciate what's going on, they tell you 17 examples of all the bad things that their son or daughter is doing that's concerning them. How do you interrupt that? Well, you may or may not want to interrupt that, but if it's just going down this negative spiral kind of thing, sometimes we ask, but what are the times in which your kiddo is making you proud or making you laugh, or when they're showing you their stuff? And a lot of times, kids who are failing out of school are like dropping off their younger siblings at the Head Start preschool and packing lunch for everybody. And also, I've talked to many Archdiocese Catholic school kids that they leave school, do homework for 3 hours, take care of their family because their parents are working, and then they go and like answer the phone at the pizza place. There are some remarkable kids who are, their parents are very concerned about them, but if we kind of open up a robust and comprehensive appraisal of what they're up to, then we position parents to go, true. and how do I think about the thing that I'm concerned about in light of the things that are giving me hope as well. The presuppositional inquiry is, I don't know, I don't know if it's like a self-fulfilling prophecy kind of theory or a hypnotic suggestion kind of thing, but I like it because if we assume that families will get on, that's respectful. Presuppositional inquiry is this idea of kind of assuming to a parent, probably this is going to become manageable, or we're going to be doing a moving through, and it's going to take a bit for it to get a lot better, but it's going to get slowly better. What will be the beginning things that we'll notice? Which is not so different than how do we, what would represent changing this 9 out of 10 stressful scenario into like a 6 out of 10 stressful scenario. It's measurement, but it's using inquiry. Now, big picture for all of these models is we never impose the model of parent interface because we're enthusiastic about it. We roll it out because it has some relevance that's informed by our assessment of the context, and we're flexible. We can give coaching while also imparting a lens, while also trying to empower parents. And so that's kind of the integrative psychotherapy at its finest, when we can think about the person more than the technique in our approach. So that was a long way of me saying in brief that there are lots of ideas that might support our efforts in reaching out to parents to coach and consult, to impart ways of interface with their kiddos that they might use and not need us to do so, or even just to kind of empower our parents. So there you go. You could read books on each of those things. You can take trainings on each of those things. You can have your supervisors mentor you if those are models that they're familiar with. But I think more important than the models themselves is maybe the notion that with preparation, we can have not only like a technique of like, what am I going to ask on the first interview, but we can anchor that technique into a theory that organizes our approach to this collaboration. So we can talk about the group's questions, reflections, reactions, and then I don't know if you want to take a break or not, but I have a case we can think about together, and also some activities around, practicing our introductions to parents and our check-ins with parents. So here I defer to Sheena and Tony. What would be the best?
I think we need a break.
Okay.
So tell us how many minutes. Would 10 do it?
Yeah, that's great.
Okay, 10 minutes, it's 11:54, add 10 to that, and we know when to come back.
Okay, see you soon. Counselors about, oops, okay, there we go, recording in progress. Yeah, I was thinking that we can look at a vignette together and think about a specific young person and her parents and how we might think about partnership with them. So that's one activity. I was thinking it might also be useful for us to think through and talk out a bit, how do we introduce ourselves to parents in line with this theme? And then finally, assuming that it would be semi-usual, at least for many of the therapies that you're participating in, to kind of be in the trenches with the kiddo and see them for periods of time, but to have intermittent touch-ins with parents to kind of think about those examples and some considerations around that as well. But before doing so, I want to invite, and of course, not just to me, but to me, if you like, or to the faculty members and supervisors on the call, and even best of all, to each other. Let's float some questions to stimulate some conversation about this topic of partnering with parents. And you might want to share something in relation to one of the models. I like it, or I'm concerned about it, or what I wonder about, or it might be an ethical question or a clinical question, or a, hey, when this comes up, what does the group think, question. But with our unifying thread being, the adventures of helping kids in context of partnering with their parents. So the floor is open, and if you want somebody specifically to respond, say so, or if you just want to say your thought process, and it'd be great to hear from 4 or 5 or 6 different people. Please, is that Emma?
It is Mai.
Hi. Yeah, please. Thank you. Start us off.
So I have a more logistical question, actually. Anybody can answer it, maybe of your experience working in schools, So pretty much, first of all, I just love your presentation as a whole. So thank you so much.
Welcome.
So I'm just curious, how would it look like to ask a parent to come in? Like, do we ask them to come in during school hours, after school, or like how does the meeting process goes? I'm just curious.
Yeah. I think it depends on the norm of your school and the parameters of your agency. I think the advantage of welcoming them to school is that you're conceptualized as a community member and a teammate and an education colleague, and not as like a weirdo sidebar mysterious therapist. So kind of being a part of the milieu has its advantages. But we also, talked about parameters. If early morning or lunchtime phone call or later evening is the best a parent can do and the only thing that they can do, there might be good reasons to broker permission to extend ourselves in that way. So there might be a hard, fast rule in your location, but I think, conceptually, there would be very thoughtful reasons to vie for that, and maybe some reasons not to.
Thank you.
Very briefly, we can't be in the building solo. So in group, let's talk more about what the day looks like at a particular school. And we don't want you going out for coffee with parents. So we're talking during school, probably phone, Zoom, and certainly that does open up evening.
Thank you.
And that'll probably or presumably change when the world normalizes post COVID. So we're being flexible. Yeah, please mic on in. Your is it Rita? Your question or consideration?
Yes, it's Rita, but I think Victoria was before me. So I want to respect my colleague there.
Awesome, Victoria. Let's hear it.
Thanks, Rita. No worries. I have a question. Given the prevalence and difficulty of dealing with childhood sexual abuse, I was wondering what you have seen in schools as really effective prevention programs that allow everybody to be informed, parents, workshops, children, either sex ed or social and emotional learning programs, or other kinds of ways of acting with children that might protect them and equip them in order to face this.
Sure.
I think this is of surfacing a suspicion rather than, obviously, when a child comes and tells you something, you make a CPS call and then that's
right. I think child therapists are frequently the ones to first understand, notice, be concerned about said issue because of our training and paying attention to the indirect communications of children or the the indicators of compromised wellness. And so we certainly don't sound the fire alarms without good grounds. I think assessment it's prudent. Partnership with parents is prudent too, because we never want to alienate people, even if we're concerned about something that may have been perpetrated at their hands. CPS involvement, it's very problematic because as you know, public schools are strained and county systems like CPS are strained, unless there's like a meth lab in a family's home, sometimes something we would be so worried about, they won't even send somebody out to look after it. So I think we have to be very prudent in our assessment, and it's kind of like a process of raising concern and asking questions more so than a, you know, sound the fire alarm approach, unless of course, Victoria, it's exactly what you said, that we passed that threshold of reasonable suspicion or concern. In terms of the school like culture, like now we're in the world of like risk management and litigious. A lot of times parents can't even walk onto school unless they took this online certification of whatever, and that's not really education, that's litigious, you know, avoid getting sued kind of thing. I think that the best I've seen are schools that have the teachers use modularized curricula, or the counselors push in to talk like with the older kids who are in their dating experiences, safe touch, consent, and with the younger kids is a stranger danger, the help seeking, the openness to the parents. I think, you know, in a play therapy context, if it's very hard for a kid to talk about abuse that was confusing, or it was abusive, but they didn't understand it as such, that's when our indirect therapy methods tend to be very, very useful. But I think I think we're in alignment here, Victoria, that this is more of like, we're going to do better in terms of like taking a public health and a prevention stance than taking a, you know, we only address when we become aware of it position. So if anybody needs or wants a project, or it's taken a bit for your visits to get up and running and popping, extend yourselves to your schools, if it's okay with your supervisors, to say, hey, may I give an in-service to the faculty, or a shop talk to parents, or a little unit to the junior high kids or something like that. I think these efforts are stellar. And I think mental health professionals tend to be a little bit more comfortable doing this than classroom instructors. That's my thought process. Yeah. Go ahead, Rita.
Yes. Thank you for the whole presentation. I was wondering if you could put your information contact. That way I can reach out outside. I'm about to go pick up my daughter and log off.
Yeah, it's on. Yeah, I'll send to Tony and your supervisors.
All right. Thank you.
You're welcome. Okay. Does anybody want to say something about the model, or something about your musings and working with kids and parents? Let's see.
Yeah, I have a question.
Oh, please.
Actually,
please.
I have two questions. I'm
right.
Gilan. Thank you very much for your presentation. Super interesting.
You're welcome.
Okay, so two questions. One of them is, at the very opening, you said that we are not bound by confidentiality to the child, but to the family. And so if the parents come, we have to disclose things to them. Did I understand you correctly?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. So,
some of my, I want to acknowledge that some of my colleagues take issue with that as a clinical position. But for me, there is in no uncertain terms that question is legally answered.
Right. Yeah. And I take note of the weight that you ascribe to that by opening your conversation to us with that, right? Now that creates a certain tension with the therapeutic alliance between us as therapists and the child. And so how do you handle the situation where a or both parents drop in and ask for you to disclose everything about the conversation, about the interaction or bits of it?
Yeah.
And yeah, how do you handle that? And then I have a follow-on question.
Sure. Let me address the first one. The first is that I don't, and I'm saying what you know, I don't do this indiscriminately. So it's not, I'm going to give a blow by blow. I try to use tact and judgment, while also holding myself to the standard of ultimately understanding that the parents have the right to know if they pepper me with a very specific question. Is my daughter cutting? Did my son, whatever. But that being said, I think it's much better addressed on the front end. And conceptually, as a family therapist, my belief is that improving relationships improves health. And if there is already tension, then grappling with that tension has some relevance to improving relationship. So if a kiddo needs, hey, I had my first kiss, or I tried my first beer, or I horsed around in class, like, okay, I don't feel so nervous that I have to tell the parent something mundane. But big ticket items, or like critiques that parent, like a lot of kids in step blended families. I can't stand my those kind of things. I think if it seems to be relevant to the overall system's health, I want to always work and trend towards bringing whatever is a point of strain or contention into the therapeutic conversation. But the other thing, I think this is more just a new counselor habit, depending upon your position, and yours might be different than mine, informed consent at the very beginning, we front load this so that it's not like, oh shoot, there was a crisis and the parent wants to come into the visit and we don't want them to yet, right? Or the kid is mad at us that we told the parent something. As much as possible, we want to say what our legal mandate is, but also like what our approach to it would be. And then we try to broker a consensus that feels comfortable. I often tell parents, hey, any big ticket items or risk issues, you will be looped in immediately. And there may be some things where, if you trust my judgment, let's give your kiddo a second to confide it in a person outside of the family, and we'll work towards getting it back to you. So it's not like it's saying to a parent, I will never box you out, but I would like to use some discretion. And that's, if we have informed consent as that being a handshake, that often helps. A lot of times when parents barge into a session, it wrecks the therapy. A lot of times when parents are held out of a session, it wrecks the therapy, right? So it's like, to the extent that we can make it a part of the beginning agreement to give it a whirl and to have some like preordained structure, I think that is a prudent thing to do in my thinking.
Okay, thank you. And my second question, if I may, is regards parental alienation. And while we've got parental alienation is child psychological abuse, and it doesn't fall under the mandated reporting, and yet it has very high mortality and morbidity. So how do you handle those situations?
I'm sorry, I'm either missing the term or not familiar with it. Parental
alienation, when like the Minuchin enmeshment cutoff, when one of the parents, especially in the context of high conflict divorce, alienates the other parent from the child's life.
Yeah. Okay. So I mean, our systems thinking usually incorporates the idea that the person not in the room is in the room. They're in our psychology. That they're missing is important. That we miss them is important. That we're frustrated and hurt by them is important. And to the extent that I think Rita had to sign off, it was her question about divorce. A lot of times there might be an agreement of who can initiate the treatment, and not like if a parent does not have medical custody, they only have some weekend custodial custody or something like that. So we have to understand those parameters so we don't step in hot water. But I think by and large, even if dad was a bad actor who had jail time and etc., I think we should try. I think we should try because it helps us understand the kid's experience better. And again, we can't presume that we know or don't know that the alienated parent couldn't be a health promoting resource, and or that there isn't a margin for improving relationship between the alienated parent and the kid. There are going to be clearly times when the parent is alienated because their behavior has been unsafe or inappropriate. But where my thoughts go is not should we try to reach the alienated parent. How do we broach that the custodial parent would probably prefer us not to, if that's a situation? That's more delicate.
Thank you very much.
Oh, you're welcome. These are the ones that we just have major brainstorms on with our supervisors. We need our colleagues to think these through. Yeah, Dylan, please let's hear your thoughts.
Oh, I just had a question. And I guess it's kind of piggybacking off Guillaume's question. At my last site, and I'm pretty sure, and I don't know, I was just like trying to look it up and reread the mandates from like my old school program, but at my last site, because California state law, right, it's like anyone over the age of 12 can consent to mental health things. There were, at my last site, there were, self-consent was an option, but it was very rare that we utilized it because we always tried to have parents involved. But like for some of my kids, I had to do self-consents because it was around issues that weren't necessarily reportable, but a lot of like sexuality and gender issues. And I'm just kind of wondering like how your model kind of, or your approach conceptualizes that, where if we let the parents into that, it would actually like directly jeopardize the child's safety.
Yeah, great. So, and this is a perfect way to formulate and think through pros and cons. Legal is legal and clinical is clinical, right? So if legally a kid can, because it's an abuse issue or they're homeless or it's related to, you know, pregnancy or sexuality or, you know, this, if a kid can, then we welcome them. That's legally permissible under the cases where it's permissible. Now, it's a different, you know, kind of discernment altogether as to whether or not. I just did this the other day, working with a very traditional Christian family from a village in Central America, and the kid confided his, you know, coming out to me first, and his dad was having a hard time. And we, you know, one of the things that mattered was like try to like keep it a cultural conversation. We talked about God doesn't make junk, and you know, more longer story, and I will not do it justice, but even though the kid did not want immediately or expediently for his parents to know he was doing therapy, or even to work on his parents accepting of that or not, or their relationship, he just wanted to have a space for support, which was needed. If you know, your estimation is that even further health promotion is possible vis-a-vis involving parents, you know, and if a kiddo would be harmed, and there's good reason to believe that, we don't try. But if it would be hard and arduous and delicate and nuanced but holds promise, that doesn't mean we shouldn't try. And so in those cases, we can think, you know, what's the safety issue? What's the potential issue? What's the kid's preference? Because just like parents have the right, when they give us their consent, kids have the right to block consent if they're consenting to the treatment on their own. But again, if you believe in the principles of family therapy, I think we always keep it on our short list of wondering about how. And for a lot of our LGBTQ youth, for parents to think of them as whole people and not as deviant matters greatly to their adjustment, whether or not, you know, the family relationship improves. So I think there's more reasons to try than to not. But if it's like, if you come home, I will beat you. Okay, then all right, that's a variable. Yeah, I mean, again, here's where we need our colleagues to do some thorough thinking through. But I guess a big picture offering I'll leave you with, Dylan, is we have our, you know, the legal parameters, and then the clinical ones are the considerations around what would promote health, and what is a prudent strategy or hypothesis. Yeah.
Thank you. Yeah. Thank you. My last site, we didn't really do family stuff. So it's always, I like
Yeah.
getting other.
I think it'd be pretty unusual in a school-based position to have a kiddo consent without their parent being able to know. But not impossible, and good to know when you have your adventures in other places that therapists operate. Let's see, Jesus.
Hello. Yes, I want to ask about the calibration of approach that you were mentioning.
Yeah.
When it comes to the parent and child, without taking up too much time, right now I'm working through a private contract with a client, and I had the chance to speak to the parents. But this client, he has numerous comorbidities, and he's actually 31 years old. And what we're starting to realize is that as the older he's getting, his symptomatology is getting worse. But the main one being obsessive compulsive disorder. He touches the walls a lot, or the doorknobs, and it's getting in the way of his life. Thankfully, he's finally able to live on his own. But you're mentioning how if you found yourself, or you used the example of the parents continuing to talk about all the issues that there is with their child, as opposed to the positives.
Mm-hmm.
And I find it really hard to ever express myself, because I don't want to cross that boundary of wanting to say that, you know, maybe you should say this to him instead of treating him like that. Like, because I almost feel like I might get, it's almost getting too personal, or maybe just knowing my place. But how would you go about that, or being able to explain that? Because I've tried, but just being respectful, of course, the topic gets changed or anything. So I just leave it at that.
Yeah,
Um,
always very delicate. I think, you know, in the context of anxiety, one of the things that we at least generically want parents to do is to let their young people have mastery experiences by, you know, facing the fear and doing it anyway. So there's no avoidance. And a lot of times by parents musing on what can't be done, what shouldn't be done, it precludes a kiddo from, you know, overcoming some of the things that they avoid because they expect it to be so bad, and therefore their life gets smaller and their range of behaviors gets smaller, et cetera. So from the point of view of like our understanding of anxiety, you know, the things that come up for your son that interfere with his adaptations, you know, his health and independence, it's going to be improved by, and seems to me that, you know, you guys play a great role in encouraging him along the lines of, and it, you know, again, how here's another thing that we do in our relationship with parents, you know, that's back to that calibration idea, assessment of transference, countertransference, but also of our own relationship. If I presume Jesus, as a person who's cared about their son and has been professional and polite, you've earned some cred in their eyes. So a calculated confrontation of, ma'am, let me run this by you. Here's my thought process. Sir, I think it would make a terrific difference if. And so I don't think we have to be without opinions as psychotherapists, especially, you know, if we're not doing growth-oriented, you know, dynamic, experiential, relational therapy. Like if we work with kids, then presumably we're identified as people who know something about child development and transition age youth. And it's not that we know best, but I also am of the mind that you should say what you know. And you know something about OCD, you know, maybe something that he could take the bus or get a job, and they're saying, no, he can't. So you could say what you know, and then let's reflect, let's talk about it. You know, that's kind of a clinical approach.
Yes, no, thank you.
You're welcome. I love that you're grappling with it, because I mean, this is a great example for the whole group, how Jesus, if I'm correct in following you, you're conceptualizing maybe your patient would get even a little bit better based on the interactions with his parents changing, right? So that's family systems at its, you know, clearest.
No, you beat me to it. It's just they don't have time. You know that they're always saying they don't have time. They're just so busy, and
yeah,
and just being honest with you, I mean, they're wealthy. You know, they don't have. They're winning his love over with giving him all the nice things, but the one thing that they need the most is they don't touch him. There's no affection. It's just verbal, but it's just it's just things like that, you know.
yeah.
And they're embarrassed. I could tell right off the bat that they're embarrassed. Like it's embarrassing when I come over and then he's doing his habits, and to me it's not. It's what I'm studying for and I'm used to it, but to them it's not, you know.
Well, and I mean, so even more like broadband examples that are clear in your sharing, Jesus. You know, the I'm embarrassed about this, and therefore I can't relate to it very much, could be cultural or historical or idiosyncratic or based on past traumas or shame, and even the you know, kind of the I don't know what to do about it, so I defer to the professional person, and even like in the context of anxiety, like enabling exacerbates anxiety, and so there might be a way in which they have to challenge him, not comfort him, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But status, like in the biggest picture of ways, our interface with parents, we could think about it as a constructive way of lending momentum to the good and breaking up the status quo that's not so helpful. You know, and it's not that we say what they should do, we just wonder, is there something else that would be useful? Yeah, and I think that's a very non-intrusive yet values forward way of trying to insert some influence. It's 12:30 and smart people like you have to finish theses and go to meetings and eat lunch and all this. So let me leave you with just a couple real quick. Let's see. So we could do a vignette another time, or you could do it with your supervisor. So I'll send that along. I was going to invite a vignette review. How do we introduce ourselves during the first phone call? It's good to practice the words. And then what are some of the considerations and time points where we might do interval check-ins? But here's my in conclusion slide. I have two. In conclusion, notice the smooth transition to the end. Here it is. Okay, early and often is groovy. Involve parents in the ways that you can, in the ways that make sense, in the ways that are called for, and calibrate your strategy for doing so. Here's another, and this is not specific to parent work, but it's specific to community work. Build your colleagues up. If you talk to a doctor or a social worker or a teacher, before you consult with them, almost pretend like they're in the military or the fire department and say, thank you for your service. Because lots of folks are jumping ship and doing high-end jobs and leaving the community trenches where we're most needing people like yourselves. So I think, a beautiful thing to do in your school-based rotation is not only to get better at the skills germane to individual therapy sessions, but all this other stuff, right? Supporting the systems, supporting the players in those systems, and also practicing advocacy, case management, consultation, teaching, etc. Our book knowledge gets us up and running, but our adventures in meeting lots of families and parents and kids is our true education. And so I want to invite that in your once a week group or in your once a week one-on-one with your individual supervisor who's going to sign on your hours, make a decided effort to talk about work with parents. Make it a focal point. What should I do? How should I try? What would you suggest? I tried this. How do you see that? What language do I use? And if they ask me, well, why do you need me to come? How do I connect that to the goal or the presenting issue or a compelling reason? I think the more we illuminate this in our minds, the better it goes, really. Soapbox, sorry, soapbox. Hey, we need you. We need you. You can see in a couple of hours of listening to a clown like me, I am no authority. And yet it takes 9 months to see me. That shouldn't be so. That shouldn't be so. The reason why it's so is because new folks are orienting towards things that are lucrative and in the private sector, and that's understandable and not a bad thing. But I implore you to dedicate the beginning portion of your career or part-time and a full-time working life to community visits. You know a lot, you're learning a lot, and you'll make a splash. And so for whatever it's worth, it's interesting, deeply gratifying. And by the way, you can pay your Costco bills and take vacations if you take a health department job. So it's not like only private office therapists, make the big bucks or something like that. So do think about it. And if you have any apprehensions about working with parents because it's the first go in doing so, it's like mindfulness. Hello, apprehension. Just notice it, be aware of it, and maybe even conceptualize that anxiety as a good thing because it shows a respectful awareness of how important it is what we're kind of charged with doing. If we took it lightly or thought it was no big deal or didn't want to prepare for it or have any jitterbugs about it, I'd rather not have that person be my colleague. I'd rather the person who was, engaged enough to feel nervous. If it's a joy for you, go for it and learn more. And if it's really hard for you to stretch, is like, I love kids, no problem. But the parent part, that's hard for me. If that's kind of more where you're at, then my recommendation is just start in little ways. Make calls, give update emails, do it with a mentor, watch another person at school do it. Just get oriented because, every attorney had their first case, every teacher taught their first course, and every therapist has their first conversation with a parent. St. John Bosco said, do your duty, do it well, and do it with joy. That's a good one in general and a good one for child therapists. And here's my email. I am your community colleague. It would be a pleasure to hear from you.